Picture this. A young Greek man walks into an Egyptian temple around 530 BCE. He's been granted permission to study with the priests, an honor that required letters of introduction from powerful people back home. The temple walls are covered in hieroglyphs. The priests are teaching from papyri, some of them already ancient, passed down through generations of scholars. The Greek's name is Pythagoras. He'll spend the next 2 decades here. On the shelves of this temple sits a mathematical text. It's solving geometric problems, specifically calculating the relationship between the sides of a right-angled triangle. The papyrus is already 1,370 years old when Pythagoras arrives. Today, we call this principle the Pythagorean Theorem. Here's the problem. How do you discover mathematics that's been documented and taught for over 1,000 years before you were born? You don't. You learn it. Here's another one. The Moscow Mathematical Papyrus contains a formula for calculating the volume of a truncated pyramid, what mathematicians call a frustum. This formula demonstrates understanding of proportional relationships and geometric principles that wouldn't appear in European mathematics for centuries. The papyrus is dated to around 1850 BCE. Euclid, the Greek mathematician whose Elements is considered the foundation of geometry, worked in Alexandria around 300 BCE. That's 1,500 years after Egyptian mathematicians had already developed the geometric principles that fill his famous textbook. Now, let me make this timeline unmissable. In 1900 BCE, the Egyptians were solving Pythagorean problems in the Berlin Papyrus. In 1850 BCE, Egyptians were calculating frustum volumes in the Moscow Papyrus. In 500 BCE, Pythagoras was born, 1,400 years later. In 300 BCE, Euclid's Elements appears. That's 1,550 years after the Moscow Papyrus. So here's the question nobody wants to ask. How did these Greek mathematical geniuses suddenly develop ideas that Egyptians had been using for over 1,000 years? The answer isn't mysterious. It's documented. These Greek scholars traveled to Egypt and studied there, sometimes for decades. They learned from Egyptian priests and scholars, and then they went home and got credit for discovering mathematics. This isn't speculation. This is in their own historical records. Greek historians documented who studied in Egypt, where they studied, how long they stayed, and what they learned. Today, we're going to look at the evidence and how the timeline of Egyptian mathematical achievement compares to when these Greeks supposedly invented mathematics. Let me show you exactly what happened. Now, let me be clear. Egypt wasn't the only ancient civilization developing sophisticated mathematics before Greece. This story is bigger than any single civilization. The Babylonians had their mathematical traditions. The Plimpton 322 tablet, dating to around 1800 BCE, demonstrates they were working with Pythagorean triples at roughly the same time as Egyptian mathematicians. Indian mathematicians documented in the Baudayana Sulba Sutras, dating to around 800 BCE, also demonstrate knowledge of what we call the Pythagorean Theorem, centuries before Pythagoras was born. So why focus specifically on the Egyptian-Greek connection? 3 reasons. First, the documentation is explicit. We have direct evidence in Greek sources themselves that specific Greek mathematicians traveled to Egypt and studied with Egyptian priests. We don't have comparable documentation of systematic Greek study in Babylon or India during this formative period. Second, geography and access. Egypt was right across the Mediterranean from Greece. Alexandria became a Greek city where Egyptian and Greek scholarship intersected. The Great Library of Alexandria actively collected Egyptian mathematical texts. The knowledge transfer pathway between Egypt and Greece is clear, documented, and direct in ways that connections to Babylon or India were not during this period. Third, and this is crucial, the erasure served a specific purpose. When later historians created the narrative of Greek genius inventing mathematics, they erased African contributions while sometimes acknowledging Eastern influences. The systematic minimization of Egyptian mathematical achievements served colonial narratives about African intellectual capacity in ways that didn't apply to Asian civilizations. You'll rarely hear anyone claim Babylonians or Indians couldn't do mathematics, but claims that Africans lacked mathematical sophistication justified centuries of colonialism. This isn't about claiming Egypt was the only ancient civilization with advanced mathematics. Multiple civilizations independently developed sophisticated mathematical knowledge. What we're documenting here is that Greeks learned directly from Egyptians, that this knowledge transfer is explicitly recorded in Greek sources, and that this specific contribution has been systematically erased from how we teach the history of mathematics. So let's look at exactly what Greek sources tell us about who studied in Egypt, what they learned, and how that knowledge became credited as Greek discoveries. Let's start with Thales of Miletus, often called the first Greek philosopher and mathematician. Ancient sources state that he studied in Egypt for 7 years. He lived around 600 BCE and is credited with bringing geometry to Greece. That's the standard story. Plutarch, the Greek historian, in his Life of Solon, explicitly documents that Thales traveled to Egypt and studied geometry with Egyptian priests. Priests who were the knowledge keepers of mathematical and astronomical traditions, going back thousands of years. Thales is famous for predicting a solar eclipse in 585 BCE. That prediction required access to astronomical records spanning centuries, patterns of when eclipses occurred, and mathematical models for predicting future events. Egypt had been systematically observing and recording celestial events for thousands of years by the time Thales arrived. He didn't figure out the eclipse prediction from scratch, but don't take my word for it. Listen to what the Greeks themselves documented. The historian Diogenes Laertius, citing the scholar Pamphila, wrote explicitly, having learnt geometry from the Egyptians, Thales was the first to inscribe a right-angled triangle in a circle. And when it came to the 365-day calendar Thales is credited with discovering, Diogenes notes it was a fact that had long been known to the Egyptians, who set their year by the more reliable indicator of the annual rising of the star Sirius. Thales didn't discover it. He learned it. Thales also developed a cosmology based on water as the fundamental element. Interesting choice considering that the Egyptian concept of Nun, the primordial waters from which all creation emerged, was central to Egyptian religious and philosophical thought for millennia. That's not a coincidence. That's what knowledge transmission looks like. Now let's talk about Pythagoras. Multiple Greek historians, Isocrates, Diogenes Laertius, in Lives of Eminent Philosophers, Book 8, Iamblichus, in Life of Pythagoras, document that Pythagoras spent extensive time in Egypt. Pythagoras studied in Egyptian temples, learning geometry, astronomy, and what Greeks called mysteries, which meant religious and philosophical knowledge that was restricted to initiates. What makes this even more definitive is what Thales himself said. Iamblichus records that Thales, the supposed father of Greek philosophy, confessed to Pythagoras that the instruction of these priests was the source of his own reputation for wisdom. He told Pythagoras that if he studied with those same Egyptian priests, he was certain of becoming the wisest and most divine of men. Iamblichus documents that Pythagoras then passed 22 years in the sanctuaries of temples, studying astronomy and geometry, and being initiated in no casual or superficial manner in all the mysteries of the gods. 22 years. That's not a brief visit, that's a complete education. The Berlin Papyrus we spoke about earlier, the one with the right-angled triangle problem 13 centuries before Pythagoras, wasn't an isolated example. Egyptian rope stretchers, the Harpagonapti, were famous throughout the ancient world for their ability to create perfect right angles in construction. These weren't obscure craftsmen. They had an international reputation for geometric expertise that Greeks themselves acknowledged. They did this using ropes knotted at intervals of 3, 4, and 5 units. When you arrange a rope like that into a triangle, you automatically get a right angle. That's the 3-4-5 right triangle, a specific case of the Pythagorean Theorem. The Great Pyramid, built around 2560 BCE, demonstrates this principle in its construction. The precision of the angles, the geometric relationships between its dimensions, all of this required practical understanding of the mathematical principles we associate with Pythagoras. Think about that for a moment. The man who gets credit for discovering the relationship between the sides of a right triangle spent 22 years studying in a country where that mathematical principle had been documented in teaching texts for over 13 centuries before his birth. This isn't controversial in historical scholarship. It's just not emphasized when we teach the history of mathematics. We say Pythagoras discovered instead of Pythagoras learned in Egypt. Then there's Eudoxus of Cnidus, around 380 BCE. Greek historian Diogenes Laertius, in Lives of Eminent Philosophers, documents that Eudoxus studied for 16 months in Heliopolis, one of Egypt's major centers of learning, particularly for astronomy. He studied with Egyptian priests, getting direct access to astronomical data and star catalogs that represented thousands of years of systematic observation. Eudoxus is credited with developing mathematical models of planetary motion. He didn't develop those models sitting in Greece, staring at the sky. He developed them by accessing Egyptian astronomical records that were far more extensive and precise than anything that existed in Greece at that time. Once again, this is documented in Greek sources. Diogenes Laertius records that Eudoxus traveled to Egypt bearing letters of introduction from Agesilaus to Nectanebus, who recommended him to the priests. The celestial models he's credited with developing didn't come from Greek innovation. They came from established Egyptian knowledge. Egypt had developed a 365-day calendar organized into 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 additional days, around 3000 BCE. Creating a calendar that precise required generations of systematic solar observation and mathematical calculation. The alignment of Egyptian temples and pyramids to celestial events demonstrates applied astronomical knowledge. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with remarkable precision of less than 1/10 of 1 degree of error. Achieving that requires understanding how to use stellar observations to determine true north, which requires knowing which stars to observe and how to calculate their positions. When Eudoxus spent those 16 months in Heliopolis, this is what he accessed. Not raw data to figure out himself. Refined knowledge with established methods. Now we come to Euclid, around 300 BCE, working in Alexandria, an Egyptian city that had recently become a center of learning. By this time, Greek mathematicians like Thales, Pythagoras, and Eudoxus had spent the previous 300 years working with the geometric knowledge they'd learned in Egypt. Shortly before Euclid's time, the Great Library of Alexandria was founded, and it actively collected texts from throughout Egypt, including mathematical and astronomical works from ancient temple libraries. Euclid is called the father of geometry, not because he invented it or that the Greeks didn't have an established geometric tradition before him. It's because Euclid created the first comprehensive systematic textbook that organized all existing geometric knowledge into a logical framework for Greek contexts. Listen to what the Greek philosopher Proclus wrote in his commentary on Euclid in the 5th century CE. Proclus explicitly states, "Among the Egyptians, geometry is generally held to have been discovered. It owed its discovery to the practice of land measurement." He then traces the transmission. It was Thales who, after a visit to Egypt, first brought this study to Greece. Then Proclus describes Euclid's actual role. Euclid composed elements, putting in order many of the theorems of Eudoxus, perfecting many that had been worked on by Theaetetus, and furnishing with rigorous proofs propositions that had been demonstrated less rigorously by his predecessors. Proclus is describing systematization and formalization, not original discovery. Euclid's Elements isn't a book of new discoveries. It's an organization of existing knowledge that ultimately traces back to Egypt, as Proclus himself acknowledges. Now here's what's crucial. The Greeks themselves acknowledged all of this. Ancient sources record that all Greek writers are unanimous in ascribing without envy to Egypt the priority of invention in the mathematical sciences. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, wrote that the Egyptian method of counting time is, to my mind, a more accurate one than that of the Greeks. Aristotle stated explicitly that mathematics had its birth in Egypt. These aren't Afrocentric claims. These are Greek historians, in their own words, documenting where their knowledge came from. The erasure didn't happen in ancient Greece. It happened later, when colonial narratives needed to rewrite this history. Now, here's the defense you'll hear. But Greeks added rigorous proof. Egyptians had practical knowledge, but Greeks created theoretical mathematics with formal proofs. Think about what that implies. Egyptians had this mathematical knowledge for over 1,000 years. They taught it in institutional settings. They used it to build monuments requiring absolute geometric precision, monuments still standing today. And supposedly, they didn't understand why and how it worked. They had no proof? That's absurd. You don't systematically teach and reliably apply mathematical principles for millennia without understanding the underlying logic. You don't train rope stretchers who become internationally famous for their geometric expertise without understanding the principles. You don't build the Great Pyramid with precision we can barely match today without understanding the mathematics. What Greeks did was express that understanding in a different philosophical framework. That's a contribution to how we present and systematize knowledge in a different context. But it's not the origin of the knowledge itself. This matters because the story we're told shapes how we understand human knowledge and human capability. When African students are taught that mathematics was invented in Greece, they're being told that intellectual achievement is inherently European. When scholars spend careers studying Greek mathematics while treating African mathematics as a primitive precursor, they're perpetuating a hierarchy that the evidence doesn't support. This narrative justified colonialism, the idea that Europeans were bringing civilization to people who supposedly had none, when in reality they were looting the descendants of the civilizations that created that knowledge in the first place. The Great Library of Alexandria, which collected Egyptian texts from throughout the country, burned multiple times. When you centralize knowledge in one place written in a forgotten language and then that place is destroyed, the sources disappear. What remains is the Greek systematization. The papyri exist. The timeline is documented. The Greek sources acknowledging their Egyptian education are in the historical record. None of this is hidden. It's just not taught as the primary narrative. The Greeks were students, not inventors. And that's not diminishing Greek contributions. Systematization matters. Formalization matters. The philosophical framework matters. But we need to be accurate about what happened. In our next episode, we're going to look at another domain where this same pattern appears: medicine. We're going to meet Imhotep, the Egyptian polymath who was practicing sophisticated medicine around 2650 BCE, over 2,000 years before Hippocrates, the Greek who gets called the father of medicine. We're going to trace the same pattern. Egyptian knowledge developed over millennia, Greek scholars studying in Egypt, and then Greek scholars getting credit in later historical narratives. Because once you see the pattern in mathematics, you start seeing it everywhere. See you in the next episode.